Thank you, Angela, for coming and chatting with us on the sidelines of the IDFC Institute Political Economy Dialogues. You are Professor of Public Policy at NYU and Director of the BetaGov program, and I want to ask you all about that. But first, I want to begin with a term that you've taught me this weekend, which is pracademia. Could you explain what pracademia is?
Sure. So the pracademic is just a practitioner who's also involved in research or in academic thinking about how to improve policy and practice. So the idea is to really bridge the gap between research and practice by integrating research into practice. So a pracademic is someone who may or may not have any formal, graduate education, but someone who is really moving the dial in their agency by being involved with research. And
so tell us how this idea of pracademics or pracademia fits into the mission of the center that you direct, BetaGov. Well, early on our thinking was really modeled on some of what we saw as being high productive companies in the private sector who were really creating organizations that learned. And we thought, wow, the stakes in the public sector are so much higher. Why don't we use some of these similar strategies and bring them to the public sector? So the idea is if we rely on academics only or even kind of organizational leadership to drive learning within those organizations, we're really limited by in terms of our capacity. But if we unleash the power and the talents within our government sector, we could be trying so many things and really move towards sort of, I call this Amazon-style testing when Jeff Bezos talks about the importance of moving not from dozens or hundreds of tests into tens of thousands of tests. That's where we'll find the innovations. So we really wanted to unleash all of those talents. I mean, there are so many talented people across our government agencies who really have good intentions, and with just a little bit of help, they can learn how to learn. And that's our goal, is to really ignite this thirst for learning and recognizing that with data-generated practices, we can really make a big difference in terms of serving the public. So let me back you up a second. So you mentioned Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the fact that they're constantly experimenting. Give us a flavor of what kind of experiments the private sector is doing. Right, so a lot of you might even think of it as kind of user experience, and Google and Amazon refer to kind of alpha testing and beta testing, and alpha testing is really almost this proof of concept. They're bringing something to market, they want to see if it's feasible, if there's energy behind it, and we do a little bit of that too. So if there's something that's truly innovative in the public sector, we won't even want to necessarily think about a randomized control trial or a big evaluation study. It's just, can we feasibly bring either this technology or this new approach to bear in some government agency? And then the beta testing is really just kind of do it one way versus the other way, which one does better. And if you're doing a Google search, you're probably in some sort of randomized control trial at any given time. I mean, a whole lot of this is about how to really improve, often in the public sector, how to improve the customer's experience. So, if you're testing in Amazon, it may be playing with the configuration of this web page. If you're Google, right, they're obsessive about the colors that they have on their search page and so on and so forth. What are the kinds of things that governments might be interested in experimenting with? Almost everything we do in the government sector can be decomposed into a series of processes, and almost all of those processes can be thought of as an opportunity to learn. So whether it's reducing paperwork or mitigating paperwork, if it's how we keep our data, are we keeping our data more smartly? Is it how we interface with the public? So some of our trials, for example, involve just changing out the website. It might be some government agency trying to communicate with the public, and we can look at the click patterns. They land on the website, it looks one way versus the other way, which one is more engaging for the public. Same thing with call-in centers. You call in, what are the first words spoken to you if you're calling in to a government agency? And that can really change the nature of the rapport between the person reaching out to the government sector. I mean, we do things that are really consequential, big deal studies, even though this is rapid cycle research, as well as really tiny, these little kind of fine tuning of certain approaches. And the one that we talked about earlier was this idea of, in correction setting, and this was initially when we did this work, people thought that we were very, very odd to be doing this, kind of diffusing lavender in kind of mental health units or really high violent units, and the idea was to try to mitigate anxiety. Which is this
so
is
interesting
lavender aroma.
This is actually lavender aroma, and the idea there was that it was such a low-cost intervention, but someone on staff thought it was a good idea. And that's really the key to what we're doing, is to unleash their initiative, right? So someone on staff had the idea, let's diffuse lavender, and we're like, okay, well, before you do it, let's make sure this actually makes sense if we're going to take this on as a new approach to corrections. And so they diffused it on a randomization scheme, and well, there was a reduction in person-on-person violence, which was a positive outcome. So several of these are really kind of these tiny little modifications, sending text message reminders to people to show up to court or to a family services engagement. These small things that cost nearly nothing, I call these the $4 experiments, can often move the dial in really meaningful ways. And I think if we're thinking about efficiencies within government, if we can find low-cost ways to really improve servicing, that's a good thing. But it does more than reduce cost or improve outcomes. It changes how government employees think about their positions within their organizations. They become part of the process of helping solve problems, which I think, for those people who tend to work with us, it tends to improve their standing within their own organizations because they're becoming thinkers. So often in government organizations, especially if you're kind of at the lower end of the hierarchy, you become just a drone executing policy, which often isn't very well thought out. So our goal is to have everybody in a government organization look around and ask themselves, what if we did it differently? And to really become part of the solutions for their government agencies.
So let's talk for a second about this study, because I think it's fascinating, completely original, and I think when I first heard about it, it's like, well, that's really out there. And then when you started explaining it, it's like, hold on, this actually makes a lot of sense. Where did the idea come from?
So that's central to what we do. We often get brought into a government agency and we'll explain the sorts of work that we've done, and that often gets people's fuse lit, right? It's like, oh, we can think about all these different ideas. But what we're really interested in doing is not coming to you as the expert with the suitcase and you just, here is our brilliance, do these things, but to harness existing talents. So we usually say, just look around you in your place of work, look at the issues that you're having. What are the problems you're facing and what might be candidate solutions? So we really try to solicit the ideas from them themselves. And it's not a suggestions box, right? Which is, we've ignored those for decades. This is really them contributing, and they stay part of the process of learning. So that person who has the idea becomes the pracademic, whether they're the head of a state organization or a frontline law enforcement officer or someone in social welfare, works with us and takes 1 hour to become a pracademic with us. 1 hour of training on, this is what we're going to give to you to do this test, this is what we expect of you, and together they now go through this process with us of actually doing the learning around this idea. And then we replicate really quickly to make sure, hey, someone who didn't have that idea, are we finding the same outcome? So that's the idea of really making sure that learning diffuses very quickly through government agencies. So we have lots of replication studies. The social sciences is really bedeviled by the issue of replication.
Sure.
And reducing the cost of research allows us to do replication very quickly so that we can turn off the lights and not bother if it really isn't showing promise, but really ramp it up and expand if it is.
So, I'm a police officer in the District of Columbia, and I'm not happy with the way things are working in the municipal police department. And I have an idea about how we could fix things. I have no idea how to do that, but I know that BetaGov could help me. So I come to you with my idea, my innovation, my tweak, my nudge. Where do we go from there? How do you help me? I don't have any evaluative skills. I don't have a social science background, right? I sort of know how the system works, but beyond that,
But you're an expert in your own agency. You're an expert in the problems that you deal with every day. So you are the substance matter expert. What we can do is bring in the methodologists to help you figure out if this idea you have is a worthy one. So we have an online portal. They drop their ideas into the online portal. We ask of our pracademics, the people who are working with us, to help us access their leadership, because we have to make sure we have permission to do this experimentation within their government agency. Without leadership permission, nothing's going to happen. We almost never have any trouble with that, which is interesting. Actually, I can't think of one example where leadership just shut it down, because there's no cost to them. That's the other real important piece of this, and the ingredients that makes this work is, if it doesn't cost the leadership any money, then it's like, why get in the way of that learning? Before we get to leadership, though, when the ideas come in, we do vet for ethical, is this ethical, does it make sense? So we do have our own internal process for making sure it gets to the next stage. But if it's ethical to do, seems reasonable to do, and leadership is willing to do it, we move pretty quickly on getting that done. But there are human
subjects involved, right? So that is an obstacle in the sense that you have to make sure that your protocols meet, institutional review board
Right.
requirements and so on. So you're still subject to those constraints.
Of course, I'm at NYU, we're at a university. So what we did do early on is make sure that we have an outstandingly good relationship with our IRB. So we have a portfolio of work. Some of the work we do is exempt as process improvement
Sure.
in a government evaluation. It doesn't meet the standard of research that requires an IRB review. Others do. So it really very much depends on the work that's being presented to us. But we've really made sure to break down all the systems that really slow down studies. If the idea is to reduce the cost of research so that you can do lots of it, you have to decompose the research process into all those many parts that slow you down. And when we built BetaGov, the key was to really do that work and think about how we could make sure we bring these studies to fruition with speed, because there's nothing that kills innovation or the interest in learning than the pace of the traditional academic model.
So I just want to talk about one of your other studies. So we talked about lavender and pro-social behavior, but what do convenience store posters and crime have to do with one another?
So this is interesting. This is actually a multi-country study. An issue, we've been working in Mexico initially on looking at a huge uptick in one of the cities we were working with in business robberies. And these often involved weapons, so these were pretty serious crimes. People would come into a convenience store or to a pharmacy and hold up a person behind the cashier register. Sometimes people were injured, sometimes not. So the idea was really to kind of identify the nature of the crimes that were happening that they wanted to resolve and then think through interventions. So quite a bit of the work we do are about environmental design. And even lavender is an example of an environmental design intervention, because you're just changing the space. And this turns out that if you look at business robberies in a lot of countries, it's not just developing countries. The same was true in Canada. We have the same study underway in Canada now. That stores that have lots of commercial advertising on them, it just obscures the inside, so there's no visibility. You can't see into the store. And so this is a really simple intervention. If anybody in the public is walking past and can see into the store, well, that's a deterrent to crime. So all we do is we just take down the posters that are getting in the way.
These are the posters that you see on the front entrance
of
the
the cigarette
store.
commercials or the beer ads or the Coca-Cola, whatever it is. And we just actually put almost a frame. There's the cashier, here's the frame, and there's line of sight to the cashier to deter crime.
And just that reduces the incidence of crime.
And this has been demonstrated in previous studies, but it wasn't really done in a very rigorous way. So we made sure that we brought it in again multiple places. So it's in multiple countries doing this similar intervention and keeping an eye on the data to make sure it makes a difference.
So the part of what you do that I have the greatest difficulty wrapping my head around is, you're not a consulting firm, you're not a think tank, you're not a private sector company, you're at a university, right? And NYU is a major research university. Tell me about how this fits in with this sort of ivory tower culture of a big university, right? Because this is, as most people know, not what most mainstream academics do.
No, I think first of all, no, we definitely haven't positioned ourselves as confrontational with the traditional approach. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the traditional academic model too. Again, this is really just a parallel but complementary track looking at exploratory research and save those very big studies that are important and that do the theorizing and that do the much deeper data dives to those other academics. I think NYU actually turns out to be exactly the right place for it. I think NYU has always really positioned itself as kind of entrepreneurial, has the agility and there's actually a great appreciation, I think, at the university. It's been very easy to collaborate, not just within our own unit, but across schools. So we have, which has been so fun because we have projects now where we have very unusual suspects gathered to think about a study. So I think I have a study in prosecution where 2 people on the team were astrophysicists, and it was like government agencies were not quite sure what was going on there. Why the astrophysicists here until a week later? Now everyone loves the astrophysicists because they know more about their data than they could ever previously have imagined, because nobody understands messy, complicated data as well as astrophysicists do. So it turns out that being at a university there's a lot of efficiencies from that, because there's lots of opportunities to collaborate with people who can come in and quickly step in for not all projects can be an RCT, right? And that's where you want your colleagues to lean in and divide things out.
So I want to just probe a little bit further on this. So I'm a sort of lapsed political scientist, right? I work at a think tank, so I'm not in mainstream academia. But course, I collaborate with a lot of academics, a lot of friends who are assistant professors or professors at tenure track research universities, and what you're describing seems to be in conflict with the sort of prototypical, publisher perish kind of mentality of a university where, I've got to get out there and try to publish in a top 3 journal because I've got to think about my tenure decision. And you're saying that these two things are kind of complementary because it's not taking the place of that per se, right? You can still do that, and this is kind of but there is a trade-off involved, right? I mean, people are devoting their time, their resources, their effort, their money, and so on. So describe how that works and how you bring people in.
Sure. So we always make sure that when we do the work that we credit the government employee who raised their hand, and that's really important to keeping frequent flyers in research, people who want to come back and doing it, but also empowering them to learn. That said, so we always, their names are in everything. But journal publications have space for multiple names. If it's important to the academic who's collaborating, there's opportunities to publish. We're only a few years into this, and we are starting to be sought out by some really premier journal publications for some of the products that are being developed under this work, because I think there's a great appreciation for what we're producing is replicating so quickly because it was built in practice, and that it was something that was absolutely relevant to those agencies. So it is, NYU is massive. We're a small team within it. It certainly doesn't compromise the more traditional kind of academic effort. But I think what we're able to do is provide amazing learning opportunities for graduate students. I mean, it's very unusual in a traditional academic timeline to be able to have a student come from the concept phase. This is the problem identification. Yeah. Here's the study, and by the way, in the 3 months of your course, you've gone from beginning to end, and there's a publication. And that is unusually powerful within an academic setting. And I think, so there's opportunities to really involve students in a very productive way. Faculty can lean in and assist if they want. And there's also a way for helping, I think, we haven't done this yet, but we're in this discussion phase now of if there's new faculty, because we produce so much, so many studies so quickly, they can grab a study and say, actually, I'm going to work with this academic, but now I'm going to go into the next phase and make this a more traditional study. It's often very hard for academics to find the sites, to broker those relationships with their agencies. And because we work in so many places and have really got that trust relationship, we have access to the data, everything's already there. So it's actually a really great breeding ground for academics even, because they can get access to what they need.
I mean, I want to emphasize one thing you said, because
Sure.
I found it to be incredibly unusual, which is when you go to the BetaGov site and you look at any one of the studies we mentioned and the dozens of others, it is the government practitioner's name who is on that brief front and center, right? Not Professor so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so.
My entire responsibility at NYU is impact. And if I thought that having my name on those documents was going to drive impact, I would have pursued that strategy. When we saw what happened, when we put the names of the government employees on our work and how quickly that helped us grow this empire, this mini empire, this effort, it was very clear that by crediting them with innovation was going to breed innovation. And again, my mandate at NYU is impact. And if what drives impact is crediting them, then that's the right thing to do. Again, there's going to be multiple stages to those studies. There's lots of opportunities to do the more academic work. Yeah. But on the front end, that first exploratory study, if you can credit the person who had that idea, they're going to keep having ideas.
So I want to get back to impact for a second. Before I do that, I mean, it seems like you're sort of offering academics two things. More than two things, but I think two things in particular. One is you're performing a kind of matchmaking function, right? So I'm somebody who's interested in improving performance of social service delivery or administrative reform, but I'm not in contact with the local sheriff's department or the corrections facility in York, Pennsylvania, whatever. So you're kind of helping to create that relation, which could then lead to a longer, more in-depth study. And the second thing you're doing is you're sort of essentially performing a kind of piloting function, right? Like, let's do something really quickly. We can actually bang out a study in 4 weeks. Let's see if there's a kind of proof of concept. And then we could think about how could we maybe test this, not just in one jail, one facility, but a dozen or 2 dozen.
Exactly. So I think there's a role on the front end. And if you look at how most academics have to work very hard in pursuing the research funding, often you have to show your pilot data, or you know, what is the basis for thinking this might even be promising. So there's a front-end role of really, really quickly helping them generate some at least minimal pilot data that can go into their bigger proposals. And then on the back end, that replication opportunity really requires relationships. Now, what I think by virtue of us being so practitioner-friendly and practitioner-centered, is it helps us get relationships very quickly in multiple places. So within really 2 years, we went from a couple of places to 26 states and 6 countries. And you know, being able to kind of have a colleague come up to you and say, hey, I'm really interested in Wisconsin, I'd like to do the following. We can almost always go to our little Rolodex and say, hey, I know exactly who you should speak with. And that can cut out effort on their part hugely. So
let me come back to the impact question, because you know, I get this question a lot. I think most researchers do, which is, you know, how do you measure it, right? In fact, this morning someone was saying, you know, how do you deal with this attribution problem? And I'm curious how you think about this issue, right? Because you're doing a lot of studies, they tend to be rather short duration. And how do you demonstrate that impact to your stakeholders, to your funders, to your university?
Right. So again, we really focus on relatively low cost, or it's low cost research, because we don't charge for anything we do. So low cost is really important to keep doing what we're doing and expanding it. So a lot of the data we rely on comes from routinely collected administrative data, ideally. Now, in some of the work we do, there is no data, so we have to get into the data collection process, but a lot of it, you know, already exists, which means we are often limited in terms of outcomes analyses by what exists. And I think we're always very mindful of, is it a decent enough proxy measure for what we're after? Are we getting a signal from this data? Will that set us up to give a sense of whether or not this moves the dial in the direction that's intended? And if it is, but we don't have exactly the right outcomes measures, we can still hand that off and say, hey, there seems to be promise here. Now we need you, our colleagues who can go raise the bigger money for this, to go in and pursue this with a much broader, richer. We're never going to have the rich measures that you need to really tell a complete story. And I think we aren't self-conscious about that. I think we're very clear about that this is exploratory research. Some of these studies are not going to be perfect, and some of them are going to really just give us the first sense of whether there's anything here, which is why we need to replicate. Because on their own, you know, we aren't telling a comprehensive story, but if you do this in enough places with enough measures lining up, we can start to get a sense.
So I want to ask you about the sort of randomized control trial methodology. The RCT boom is sort of visible everywhere, right? I mean, in economics and political science and social science more generally. And I think we're at the point now where we're starting to see the beginnings of a backlash, right? I mean, I think many people still understand that methodologically it's a gold standard, right? If you want to causally identify the impact of X on Y, but there's questions about, you know, how do you aggregate? There's questions about external validity. There's questions about, you know, are you really getting at mechanisms that you could only maybe get at through qualitative research or ethnography or whatever? How do you think about that?
You know, it's really interesting. First of all, again, this is one line of research. You need many different sorts of research. At the outset, when we first created BetaGov, first of all, I was an absolute idiot in thinking of how I would build this. So the first thought was we were going to build a bunch of really cool tools, then everyone was going to go online and use our tools, and a bunch of innovation was going to happen. Well, I can tell you we would have 0 studies if all we did was post very exciting tools. The human element in this is, and actually from my staffing perspective, it was something that was a bit of a shock to me. You know, when I laid out our initial budgets, and like my human line was pretty minimal. Well, it turns out this is still human intensive. But at the outset, I was so convinced that what we really needed to be doing was a bunch of this experimental research, really the RCTs. And I've really, like, my thinking about that has really evolved. What I'm really interested now is learning. And in some cases, it turns out that the RCT is a really nice and can be a nimble way to do that for you. But in other cases, it isn't. So when we, you know, initially, we really had this, like, this it's going to be an RCT, going to be an RCT. And then what I started noticing is I was starting to turn down these opportunities to learn because I wanted to get to the RCT. And I realized the methods were getting ahead of the learning. And that is not how you learn. So if you look at, again, the kind of the high-performing companies, they have this alpha testing and the beta testing, and we were so fixated on kind of the beta and the gamma testing that the alpha was being lost. And now, so we now use the language of alpha, which is where we have something that is so new and to be brought into the government sector that it really doesn't belong within a formal study. And it took a while for me to convince my team that was a good idea. We're also increasingly adding some qualitative work to what we're doing. Data especially data that's limited to what's already in administrative data, can be extremely limiting. We are very concerned about the experience of the public as they deal with the government sector. So soliciting input from them along the way has become increasingly important to our work. Especially a lot of our work involves relatively vulnerable populations. If you think about, if it's law enforcement dealing with an arrestee, or if it's a corrections officer dealing with someone who's incarcerated. So unless we're getting the voices of the people who are subject to these new approaches, we really can't do a responsible job. And so increasingly we really are not just soliciting their input and soliciting their experiences, but bringing them into we call this now our collaborative design series, which is where we really are allowing these interventions to be completely remodeled based on input from the public too.
So you've spent the last 3 days in India, hearing probably more than you care to about India's political economy challenges and the citizen-state interaction and the problems of state capacity and administration and public policy. And I'm curious sort of what you take away from your time here in terms of, what are some of the similarities or differences, common challenges that you see in your own work? You do work in other countries in addition to the United States, but I believe it's your first time in India. Just reflect a little bit for me on how you see this.
This is very interesting. When I came here, I thought that it would be that this was going to be a very strange idea that I was going to be. I was even in this new. Even my talk was under the label. It was kind of big idea or new idea, someone assigned to it. And that it was going to be very kind of just out there. The more I spoke to there were extremely talented people gathered here, but even many government employees who were here, the more I kind of recognized that no matter where you are, there are people who are very sincerely well-intended and wanting to move the dial in terms of whatever it is that they're doing, whichever agency. And I was amazed at the people I've met with and just the openness to, wow, this is really interesting and I've never really thought this way and I can't wait to really think about how to integrate this into practice. So this, in general, I think people have been very gracious and open and willing to kind of let us come in and do this work. That said, there are requirements to doing this well. Again, there has to be engaged leadership willing to let this happen. And I think the biggest concern for work like this is when you let a team in or you empower your staff to learn, there's this automatic movement towards greater transparency. And people can be fearful of that. And so I think, I really look forward, I think we will do work in India. I really hope we do. And I think to do that well, we probably want to start in places where there's a bold leader who's really willing to take that leap of faith that it takes to let your team innovate and let the data guide where you go. And the truth is you don't need every government agency to do that. You just need a few places that has the right ingredients. And then the other thing which we really look for in a first move into a new country is the opportunity to have an early victory, so relatively low-hanging fruit, so not too much politics involved, and the opportunity to do what we do best, and that is demonstrate the value of data with speed.
But it seems to me one of the fundamental requirements is there has to be some baseline level acceptance by the leader, by the government agency, by the researcher, of failure, right? Because some of these innovations, frankly, they're not going to work, right? And if you could get 1 in 5 to work or 1 in 3 to work, that's a pretty good batting average, right?
So it's actually central part of the work we do when we engage any organization is, and I use this expression often, is nothing good can happen without the willingness to fail cheerfully. And we build that appreciation for failing cheerfully really from day one and are very clear about rewarding the process rather than the outcome. So we don't think of a study that has a negative outcome as a failure. That said, even within our own work, we want to make it easy to discontinue doing something. So which is why I think I really like this opportunity to look at data on very close time steps. If something isn't going well, let's not shut it down in 3 years, let's shut it down at week 3. and they're willing to continue to reward them and their staff and give accolades to people for trying something even if it didn't work out, because so much of what you do isn't working out. We just don't know it because we don't keep the data.
Right.
And if we're willing to take a look at that and be purposeful in our practices, we can weed out the probably more like 9 in 10 things we're doing that are either neutral or, in worst case scenario, doing harm. Because I think so often we make decisions based on our gut intuition, and we just assume that because it feels right, it does good. But that's not the case. So
there was, as researchers, right, we're often under pressure to demonstrate our value, to demonstrate success, whether that's because we got an article placed somewhere, or we got some big grant to do something, or got some honor. There's a professor at Princeton who decided to go the other way and issue a resume of all of his failures. I don't know if you've seen this, right? So it's all the grants I didn't get, all the RCTs I did that went bust. Yeah. But it actually, I think, tells you a lot about sort of the honest research process, right? I mean, I think we all sort of struggle with that.
I applaud that sort of just appreciation of failure, because it really isn't. Failure is the wrong word, because it really is. It's just honest and transparent. In our work, we shut down about 1/3 of everything we begin. Everything that's gone through human subjects clearances, it's gone through all the proposals in place, everything, all the implementation plan is ready. Before we launch, we shut down about 1/3 of them. You don't hear that in academic, in traditional world, because by the time we funded our studies, there's so much gravitas behind this that it's too expensive to fail at that point. You've got to do the study because now we're protecting the study, right? So I do like this idea of really creating a culture of, actually, the stakes are high enough here that if this should be killed, let's kill it quickly. And the only way to do that is to really start to celebrate this failure or the non-start. And then I think, this is something, I think in medication trials, we kind of adopted this philosophy of not breaking the blind. Right. We do the opposite of that. We busted open and I want to know what's happening in week 2. I want to know what's happening in week 4. And if this new thing, which we think is a good idea, is a bad idea, we owe it to the public to know that by week 4 rather than year 3.
Right, and be transparent about it.
And be transparent about it.
So I just want to end by asking you about sort of what comes next, right? So you've built this initiative. You've managed to road test it in a number of different environments on a kind of a dizzying array of different subjects. Where do you go from here?
So it was interesting, we started off with BetaGov. I have a passion for the public, but it was really quickly apparent that this was really more about an approach to learning that had many different avenues. So we started with BetaGov. Last year we introduced, towards the end of the last year, we introduced BetaEd, which is K through 12 education. It was beautiful. I mean, we just started unleashing, giving teachers the power to learn within their organizations and learn how to teach was really fun. Later this year, we'll launch Beta Health. We have our first experiments of that up and running now. And then Beta NGO, which is trying to really improve data keeping and thinking about aligning with your mission for the non-government sector. And I even think for developing countries, I'm hoping down the line we can even get into Beta Biz, which is helping small businesses thinking about the processes and improving outcomes. So of course, BetaGov didn't work really well as a label. So we still have that because it's we're now in enough places where people are familiar with BetaGov and comfortable with our team. But we did start to rebrand as Beta Hub, which is just the hub of this idea of really, it's almost like a citizen science application, right? How do we harness the power of the many people doing many interesting things, bring them into the research process so that we can go to scale? If it's only my team doing everything, we're going to run a portfolio of studies. But if we harness the power of the public, well, the sky's the limit.
I want to thank you for taking the time out to chat with me. I mean, as somebody who spends at least part of my time thinking about governance challenges and the political economy challenges India faces, I really hope that as a result of this weekend, you'll get some potential clients who want to see some of your skills at work, because I do think one of the things that we struggle with a lot in India is, first of all, having the boldness to test out new ideas and accept them if the results either way, right, if they work or don't. And one of the nice things about India is, as a large federal democracy, right, you can really exploit that federalism to your benefit to see what works and what doesn't, because you have, all of these laboratories for change, right? So thanks again.
Thank you.